Welcome to part 2 of the story of our 2014 cruise in the San Juan Islands of Washington State and the Gulf Islands of British Columbia by Steve and Helen Eshelman. 40 days and 40 nights aboard the Albin 25 pocket trawler La Dolce Vita from June 22nd to August 2nd, 2014. In part 2, we cover 15 days spent in the Canadian Gulf Islands from July 13th to the 28th, and a final 6 days in the San Juans from 28th to August 2nd, 2014. To briefly recap part 1, we arrived in Bellingham, Washington on June 22nd and launched our Albin 25 La Dolce Vita at the Squalicum Boat Harbor ramp and proceeded to cruise the San Juans for 21 days with stops at 8 different islands, ending up at Roche Harbor on San Juan Island on July 11th and 12th, before departing for Sydney, British Columbia on July 13th in company with Helen's sister Paula and her husband Alan in their Bayliner Sierra 2552 named Heavenly. Leaving Roche Harbor on July 13th, our next stop was to clear customs in the Canadian port of entry of Sydney on Vancouver Island. We spent the night of July 13th in a guest slip at Port Sydney Marina. From there, we followed Paula and Alan's itinerary with stops at Maple Bay on Vancouver Island, Telegraph Harbor on Thetis Island, Ladysmith Harbor on Vancouver Island, Montague Harbor on Galiano Island, Ganges on Salt Spring Island, Winter Cove on Saturna, Port Browning on North Pender, in that order. At that point, Paula and Alan headed back to the San Juans. We continued on our own for a night in Poets Cove Marina on South Pender Island, a night at anchor in Bedwell Harbor, another night anchored in Otter Bay on North Pender Island. We returned to Roche Harbor on July 28th and cleared U.S. Customs. From there, we spent 6 more days in the San Juans before returning to Bellingham to put our boat back on the trailer on August 2nd. Here we are, docked in a guest slip in Port Sydney Marina next to Paula and Alan's Bayliner Heavenly on July 13th. While shopping in downtown Sydney, we passed the storefront office of a whale watching tour company and noticed this chart posted in the window depicting the typical travel patterns of orcas killer whales in the Gulf and San Juan Islands. We weren't lucky enough to see any whales while in the Gulf Islands, but on July 29th, after returning to the San Juans, we did encounter a pod of orcas off the west shore of San Juan Island, south of Roche Harbor. On Monday, July 14th, we left Sydney and made our way up to Maple Bay, where we anchored for one night. Sydney, we skirted the tip of the
and we're heading up toward Maple Bay.
Satellite channel to Maple Bay.
In Canada.
Throughout our time in the Gulf Islands, we flew a Canadian courtesy flag from the jackstaff on our bow rail. While in Sydney, Helen had purchased some fresh wild-caught salmon from a local fish market. Once settled in at anchor in Maple Bay, we feasted on salmon grilled on the barbecue with sides of fresh tomatoes and canned veggies.
Slow down. The gypsy tire out.
This is us departing Maple Bay. This is us departing Maple Bay.
Notice with our slow cruising speed, we hardly make any kind of wake. This is our cruising speed, 6.5 knots, barely awake. A run of about 10.5 nautical miles, it was about a 2-hour passage to Telegraph Harbor, where we anchored near the south end of the cove. Telegraph Harbor Marina and Bistro. We left Telegraph Harbor on July 16th for a short 7 nautical mile run over to Ladysmith on Vancouver, which ended up being the northernmost stop on this cruise. We booked a guest slip for the night at Ladysmith Maritime Society Marina, and the next morning on the 17th we left at 11:30 a.m. for a 21-mile run southeast to Montague Harbor on Galliano Island. With their faster boat, Alan and Paula arrived in Ladysmith first and snapped this picture of us coming in at our 6.5 knot cruising speed. Here's Ladysmith Maritime Society Marina, a cute little marina. Our passage from Ladysmith to Montague was one of the roughest of our cruise. From our July 17th log entry, quote, pumped our holding tank before leaving Ladysmith, bound for Montague Harbor, about 21 nautical miles total, transiting Houston Channel and Trincomalee Channel. Tide currents were in our favor going south, but an opposing headwind built a steep 3-foot chop. Going head-on into the wind and waves was better than a falling sea or a beam sea. Our trusty Allman handled it easily, and we stayed dry in the wheelhouse as spray splashed our windshield. On arrival in Montague Harbor, we took the last available Provincial Park mooring buoy. We were glad to be on a mooring instead of anchored, as we were in for some breezy conditions on a lee shore for the next 2 nights.
Is that not standing in the way of what you're trying to
July 18th dawned over Montague Harbor with weather conditions fair, cool, and breezy, with cloud cover building and temperatures in the low to mid-60s. Montague was one of the most enjoyable stops in the Gulf Islands. This map shows the layout of Montague Harbor Marine Park with mooring field, landing dock, hiking trails shown in red dashed lines, and campground, paved roads shown in green, suitable for tents, trailers, and motorhomes, since Galliano Island is served by the BC ferry system. We went ashore on the morning of July 18th and hiked along the trails shown on this map and over to the beach to the west of the lagoon. We then returned to our boat for lunch on board. Paula and Alan stopped by later for a visit in mid-afternoon. Here's Helen taking a walk on the paved road through the park campgrounds. And here's the view from the beach looking northwest toward Trincomalee Channel on the other side of Gray Peninsula, which shelters Montague Harbor. The peaks in the far distance are Vancouver Island. This chart is Canadian, so the depths are marked in meters. And here's a small boat launch ramp at the head of Montague Harbor. Later that afternoon, we boarded the Hummingbird Inn pub bus with Paula and Alan for a free ride up island to, where else, the Hummingbird Inn pub for dinner and drinks. The 2-mile or so bus ride to the pub is an event in itself, thanks to the lovingly eccentric driver who outfitted the bus with cymbals, bicycle horns, and a tambourine in the center of the steering wheel, all of which he plays using drumsticks to accompany upbeat recorded music. He also hands out tambourines and rattles for passengers to join in and sing along. And a selfie. There's Alan, and off the frame to the right is, which you can't see, is Paula.
33 years he was in there. Her son was running the restaurant out of the back there, and he said, the hell with it, I'm not tired of working with my mom anymore. So he went to Europe, and he's never come back. Anyway, 33 years, amazing. Now, gotta go to the house.
And soon we arrived at the rustic little pub in the woods and had a great time sharing dinner and drinks with Alan and Paula. And Helen got to spend some quality time with her baby sister Paula, who lives in Deer Island, Oregon, near Portland. And so we don't get to see her very often. Bit of family resemblance here, don't you think? And so on the morning of July 19th, we prepared to drop our mooring and get underway, leaving Montague Harbor on Galliano Island behind, bound for our next stop at the port of Ganges on Salt Spring Island. It had been a windy night spent on the mooring with brief rain showers in the morning, so we didn't get underway until shortly after noon. Heading south out of Montague, bound for Ganges on Salt Spring, we took the long way around the south shore of Prevost Island and the Swanson Channel separating Prevost from North Pender in hopes of spotting some orca whales. But no luck there, so we continued on to Ganges, a 12 nautical mile run, arriving about 2:40 p.m., tied up for the night at a guest slip in the marina, which cost $1 Canadian per foot, $25 total. And we sauteed some red snapper seasoned with lemon and Old Bay and butter on our galley stove. Yum! We passed this small lighthouse on the southern tip of Prevost Island on the way to Ganges. We didn't take any pictures while in Ganges. Mostly we were just there to take on fuel and supplies and pump out our holding tank. Our fuel usage since the previous fill-up at Roche Harbor on July 13th was the equivalent of 6.6 US gallons for 21 hours running time on the engine, cruising mostly at about 6.5 knots. The Canadians deal in liters, and so fuel cost worked out to the equivalent of $6.26 Canadian per US gallon. Next stop after Ganges was Winter Cove on the northwest end of Saturna Island, a run of 13 miles. Arriving in Winter Cove at about 2:30 in the afternoon, we found a peaceful, sheltered bay in which to drop our anchor. We stayed here for 2 nights and were joined by Alan and Paula in their bayliner. Here Alan prepares to drop anchor in Winter Cove as Paula takes the helm up on the flybridge. Winter Cove is part of the Canadian Gulf Islands National Park Reserve and a delightful place to visit. Here we are anchored among all the other big yachts. We are almost always the smallest boat in any anchorage, but they don't get to spend one summer in the Pacific Northwest and the next on the Chesapeake Bay. Take a short walk from Winter Cove to the north side of Saturna Island and you can look out across the Strait of Georgia toward Boundary Bay on the mainland and see the far northwest corner of the lower 48 portion of the United States. Midsummer daylight hours are long at 48 degrees north latitude. This photo of twilight in Winter Cove was taken at 9:43 p.m. at local time. Here's a view of Winter Cove from the landing dock and boat ramp. We did a lot of hiking ashore on all the Gulf Islands that we visited. Departing Winter Cove on the morning of July 22nd, after 2 nights at anchor, we made a brief stop at nearby Lisle Harbor Government Dock and BC Ferry Landing before heading for Port Browning on North Pender Island. It was a short 4.5-mile passage from Lisle Harbor near Winter Cove to Port Browning on North Pender Island, where we anchored in 37 feet of water during high tide, coordinates north 48 degrees 46.4 minutes, west 123 degrees 16.4 minutes. The 10-foot tide range dropped our depth down to 26 feet at low tide. Once anchored, we took the dinghy ashore, landing at the Port Browning Marina dock, shopped for provisions, and had a turkey dinner at the Marina Pub and Cafe. Paul and Alan had opted to stay another night in Winter Cove. From our cruising log, quote, Wednesday, July 23, 2014, Port Browning, North Pender Island, BC. Remained at anchor, weather turned foul and colder, rain, overcast with ceiling as low as treetops, reduced visibility. Temps in the mid-50s, went ashore in the morning to take showers at the marina, cost 1 loonie, that is Canadian $1 coin, for each 4 minutes. Paul and Alan pulled in this morning and took a guest slip in the marina. We sat with them and had beers while they ate lunch at the Marina Cafe. Then we went back to the boat and heated up some chicken soup for lunch and stayed aboard for the rest of the day, reading, napping, and watching it rain. July 23rd turned out to be the only time in the entire 40-day cruise where we lost a full day to rain and foul weather. Leaving Port Browning on July 24th, headed for the Bedwell Harbor on South Pender Island, we took advantage of a shortcut that only powerboats can take through a cut known as Pender Canal. Sailboats can't use it as there is a road bridge crossing the canal. They have to go the long way around out into the channel and circumnavigate South Pender to reach Bedwell. Of course, there are tidal currents that run through this canal, which can either be with you or against you. Once in Bedwell Harbor, we headed straight for Poets Cove Resort Marina at the southeast end of the harbor and booked a guest slip for the night. This was one of the most upscale facilities in the Gulf Islands, with an outdoor pool and jacuzzis which marina guests are allowed to use. By then, Paula and Alan had left to return to the San Juans, and we were on our own. La Dolce Vita, the sweet life indeed. Prices were a bit steep at the Poets Cove Resort's little convenience store. $4.75 for a bottle of ketchup, $6 for mayonnaise, $5 for mustard. A 750 milliliter bottle of Captain Morgan rum cost $34, all in Canadian money, of course. We were set for provisions and didn't need to buy any of these items. After a night in Poets Cove Marina on July 25th, we motored a short distance to a nearby anchorage at Beaumont National Marine Park. That afternoon, we dropped our hook off the beach in Beaumont Marine Park and went ashore to hike. We did so much arduous hiking on steep trails that in the 6 weeks we cruised, I lost 10 pounds. The shore is so steep they built this stairway to get up off the beach and access the hiking trails. But once you made it up the flight of stairs and into the woods, the hiking was great. Soon it was time to weigh anchor once again and pull in our 22-pound Bruce with 26 feet of chain plus 3-strand rode by hand, sometimes with the help of a manual sheet winch installed on the bow. This time, on July 26, we went 8 miles northwest up the coast of North Pender to Otter Bay for 2 nights at anchor there. During our cruise, we made use of full-size paper charts, both NOAA and Canadian, plus my Garmin GPS Map 76 CX GPS loaded with Blue Chart plotter software, as well as cruising guidebooks for both the San Juans and the Gulf Islands. The Albin 25 has a convenient built-in chart table right there at the helm station. Monday, July 28th was our last day in Canadian waters as we departed Otter Bay on North Pender at 10 a.m. bound for Roche Harbor on San Juan Island, the port of entry to clear customs returning to the good old USA. Arriving in the San Juans, we pulled into Roche Harbor and tied up at the customs dock to wait our turn to clear in. U.S. customs is much stricter than Canada. In Sydney, we had tied up at the customs dock, and the only thing there was a phone kiosk, but no live persons. One picks up the phone, and it automatically connects to the district customs office, and an agent comes on the line and asks for names, boat registration numbers, how long one intends to stay in Canada, etc., and then gives out a clearance number that you have to write down on a piece of paper and keep attached to your cabin window. I asked if he needed our passport numbers, and he told us that was not necessary. We were never stopped by any customs or law enforcement officers the entire time we were in the Gulf Islands. On returning stateside, Helen had to wait on the boat while I took our passports to the customs shack. The agent took down our Canadian clearance number, then came back with me to the boat to check and make sure Helen's passport photo matched her actual appearance and that no one else was on the boat. Thus ended the Gulf Islands portion of our cruise, and we spent the night of July 28th in Roche Harbor Marina, where we shared a guest slip with another small boat, took showers, and filled our water tank. We had yet to see any killer whales, but we still held out hope for a chance to spot a pod near their usual tracks near San Juan Island. Leaving Roche Harbor on July 29th, we motored south along the west shore of San Juan Island, following the whale-watching tour boats, who had aerial spotters alert them of orca sightings. And sure enough, there she blows, a small pod of orcas came into view. Just a pair at first, but soon more came into view as they were traveling north up Haro Strait past San Juan Island. It was much more difficult to get still photos of the orcas, since one was never quite sure where they would surface next, and we only managed to get 2 still frames. We had much better luck shooting video with our Nikon digital camera. This turned out to be one of the big highlights of our trip, only a couple days before we returned to Bellingham to haul out and head for home.
There she blows.
In this next video clip, watch for the folks sitting on a paddleboard when an orca killer whale surfaces right next to them. Orcas are not really whales in the true biological sense, but are actually classed as a species belonging to the porpoise family. But as large predators, they've earned the nickname killer whale. But please forgive me for my jumpy video shooting, as it was difficult to hold the camera steady with the rocking of the boat and trying to film an extreme telephoto. The gurgling sound you hear was our diesel engine idling in neutral.
Right next to that paddle.
Yeah, I saw that.
Oh my gosh, he's right next to that paddle.
Yeah, I'm filming. Ooh, he's splashing. Look. Oh, they're having fun.
Oh wow. Wow.
Yeah, go ahead some more.
After sighting the orca pod and our other adventures, everything after that seemed anticlimactic. But we weren't ready to head for home just yet. We proceeded to Garrison Bay and anchorage to the south of Roche Harbor. A little known historical fact is that the British once occupied this part of San Juan Island from the late 1850s all the way up until 1872. During that time, there was a boundary dispute about who actually owned the San Juan Islands. The question was finally settled by arbitration, and the arbiter who ruled in favor of the U.S. was none other than Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany of World War I fame. The boundary dispute arose from an unintended glitch in the Oregon Treaty of 1846, which established the 49th parallel as the northern border between the U.S. and Canada west of the Great Lakes. But where the 49th parallel intersects the Pacific coast, the treaty defined the boundary as only as being, quote, along the 49th parallel of north latitude to the middle of the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, and thence southerly through the middle of that said channel and of the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the Pacific Ocean. The problem with that language was there are actually two channels, Haro Strait to the west of the San Juans, and Rosario Strait separating the San Juans from the mainland. So which channel should be the actual boundary? One problem was that the area had not yet been well mapped. Both countries claimed sovereignty over the San Juan Islands. The Brits claimed Rosario as the boundary, and the Yanks insisted that Haro Strait was the correct boundary. The San Juan Islands began to be occupied by employees of the Canadian Hudson's Bay Company and by individual American settlers. At first, both groups coexisted peacefully, with the border still not defined, until things came to a head a few years later, in 1859, when an American farmer shot and killed a free-roaming pig that he caught rooting in his garden. The pig belonged to a Canadian, and thus began the Pig War, in which the only casualty was the pig. When the British, who at the time still ruled Canada as a colony, threatened to arrest the American farmer who had refused to pay the Canadian for the loss of his pig on grounds that it was trespassing on the farmer's property, the American farmer asked for military protection from the U.S. Army, which obliged by sending 66 troops. In reply, the Brits dispatched 3 warships, and things escalated from there, after the Brits landed a garrison of Royal Marines and established a fort and encampment at Garrison Bay, so named because of the Brits being there. The Americans set up their own camp at the south end of San Juan Island, which was a much cruder establishment since we were preoccupied with the looming Civil War and gave San Juan Island a low priority. But at its peak, there were 5 British ships and 2,000 sailors and Marines, opposed by 461 American soldiers armed with 14 cannons. No shots were ever fired except for the one that killed the pig, and the posts became easy duty for both sides, especially for the Brits who had built a comfortable camp in a better location than the Americans. After the dispute was finally settled in our favor, the last of the British troops were withdrawn in 1872, followed by American troops withdrawing 2 years later in 1874. The Canadians' dissatisfaction with the Brits over the outcome contributed to Canada's later demands for more autonomy in conducting foreign policy. Today, both the English camp at Garrison Bay and the site of the American camp are now part of a National Historical Park. But at the American camp, only the officers' quarters buildings survive. English camp, on the other hand, has several restored buildings and a blockhouse. The British flag still flies over the English camp portion of the park. While visiting English camp, we helped the park ranger lower and fold the huge British flag at closing time. Only the USA observes the custom of folding our flag in the traditional triangle fold. The Union Jack just gets folded in a plain rectangle. We do try to make sure it doesn't touch the ground. While returning by dinghy from the English camp to our anchored boat in Garrison Bay, I noticed a flash of a blue, yellow, and red burgee on a Seaward 26 sailboat anchored 100 or so yards away. There was no wind, so it hung limp, but those were the same colors as our Lake Pleasant Sailing Club burgee. Could it be? The boat looked familiar, since one of our club members had a Seaward 26 out at a club wrapped-up several months earlier. And sure enough, it was Ken and Jen Lee on Anastasia, having come up, unbeknownst to us, from Tucson. Talk about a small world, two boats from the same club, meeting by pure chance 1,700 miles from home. And so ended our 2014 San Juans and Gulf Islands cruise, the most consecutive days either Helen or I had ever spent cruising aboard a boat. We stayed on in the islands for a few more days, leaving Garrison to go back to the main San Juan Island town of Friday Harbor to stay one night at the marina, then went over to the anchor in Spencer Spit on Lopez Island, then from Spencer Spit back to Inati Bay on Lummi Island, which was the same place where we had made our first stop almost 6 weeks earlier. By then, we were ready to go home. After one night at anchor in Inati, we left early in the morning of August 2nd for the 7-mile crossing back to Squalicum Harbor in Bellingham to put La Dolce Vita back on the trailer and prepare for the long drive back to Phoenix. Epilogue. In all, we logged approximately 280 nautical miles in 40 days afloat and put 75 hours on our 24 horsepower Yanmar engine. We burned a total of 29.6 gallons of diesel fuel, and our total fuel bill was $136 at prices ranging from a low of $2.49 per gallon at a Phoenix gas station to $6.26 a gallon at a Canadian fuel dock. Our average fuel consumption rate was 0.39 gallons per hour. Our usual cruising speed was 6 to 6.5 knots, with an overall average of 3.73 knots, counting idling and docking. We never ran our 20-gallon fuel tank down by more than 7 gallons from full and only refueled 5 times while in the islands, plus one fill-up of 7 gallons after we got home. The most we ever spent at any one fuel stop was at Ganges in the Gulf Islands, where we purchased 6.6 gallons for $41 Canadian at an exchange rate which, if I recall, was somewhere close to about 95 cents American for each Canadian dollar. In Canada, they are used to higher prices, and for cash purposes, they rarely give paper money change in denominations less than $5 bills. For smaller change, less than $5, $1 and $2 coins called loonies and toonies respectively are used. The $1 coins have an image of a loon seabird, and the toonies are slang for $2. But to us, they're not much bigger than our quarters, so it's easy to think of $1 or $2 as a very small amount. The end. I hope you enjoyed our slideshow, and we hope to have many more cruising adventures in the Chesapeake Bay and on the Nanticoke River.